And now we turn to philosophy, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce Amy Grayling, professor in philosophy, who will talk about the ethics of atheism. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, actually, what I'm going to say is not going to be very far distant from the main theme of the conference, Gods and Politics, because it bears, even if indirectly, on the question of the place of the religious voice in our public square and the effect that those religious voices should have on things like how we live our individual lives and how we educate ourselves and our children. So it's a related matter. But I'm going to come at it from a slightly tangential direction, because I want to talk in particular about two different ways in which ethical considerations relate to having a non-theistic view of the world. Just before I do, though, some remarks were made earlier on about militant atheism. We also sometimes hear the phrase fundamentalist atheist, don't we? I've often wondered what a non-fundamentalist atheist would be. This is an atheist who believes that just part of a deity exists. For example, a foot or a buttock or something like that. Or maybe that gods exist on certain days of the week. I think most religious people think that anyway. It's on Sunday, or depending on Friday maybe, depending on your outlook on life. So all these labels, fundamentalist atheist, militant atheist, they really do merit being contested. But the temptation is to say that to be an atheist is simply to bear the same relation to religion as the person who doesn't collect stamps bears to the person who does collect stamps. This is a familiar point, that atheism is just not collecting stamps, and therefore it leaves open a wide range of things that you might do otherwise. What are your hobbies otherwise? What other things do you like to do, given that you don't collect stamps? How do you fill up your time? And that's left entirely open by the fact that you're not a stamp collector. Now, if you export those thoughts to the atheism-theism dichotomy, it seems to imply that you should say, when you say that you're an atheist, that nothing else follows as to your ethical outlook, to your political outlook, to how you conduct yourself as an individual in the world. And I used to think that that was the case. Because when you think about what's at stake in the great debate, and now rather bad-tempered one, between people who have some kind of religious commitment and those of us who don't, we have to remember that there are three separable issues at stake. They are naturally connected to one another, of course, but they are separable, and it is important to remember that when one's discussing any aspect of them. So the atheism-theism debate, which is really a metaphysical debate about what kind of universe this is, what it contains or doesn't contain, that is a separate question from the secularism debate, which is the main thrust of this conference, the Gods and Politics aspect. And the secularism debate is specifically about how loud a voice the religious voice should be in the public square, how much influence the religions, organized and otherwise, ought to have on matters of public policy, and so on. And of course, it is possible for somebody to be a person of faith, or a churchman, for example, and to be a secularist. It's quite possible for somebody to be a very devout Christian, but believe the church and state, or church and religion and state ought to be very far apart from one another. That the state should be neutral, as Roy Brown put it earlier on, towards all the different religious interests in society. So to be a secularist is not automatically to be an atheist. And in the discussion that we have about the size of the footprint of religion in the public square, we have to remember that, because it might be that we can find some allies among secularist people who have a faith commitment. And then the third thing which is in play in this overall debate is, of course, the question of ethics itself, and this is where humanism comes in. A humanist is somebody who, in the broadest possible sense of the term, thinks that our ethical outlook ought to be premised on our best understanding, and it's a very incomplete and partial one, of course, but on our best understanding of human nature. You don't have to be an essentialist about human nature. You can still be learning a very great deal from sociobiology and evolutionary psychology and the other empirical inquiries, animal ethology, which inform our understanding of ourselves as continuous with the rest of nature. But you can therefore think in terms of an incomplete and partial understanding, but nevertheless say that our best endeavors in constructing an ethical view would involve trying to understand what it is to be human, what it is to be a human being, as an essentially social creature with relationships at the very heart of the best that we can make of our lives, and that we should try also to understand the human condition, conditioned as it is by history and by culture and by all the different constraints that we find ourselves dropped into when we become mature, reflective adults. So the question of humanism is a natural and immediate consequence of the question of atheism, in the sense that if you are an atheist, your obligation is to be reflective about how you live your life and what the premises of your ethics are. The secular matter also follows automatically from being atheist, because you want to try to proportion or put into the right kind of relationship with the rest of society the religious voices in society. But as you see, they are separate matters. Now, I'm not going to talk about secularism now. That's the main thrust of the conference, as I say, except towards the end to try to draw one or two implications for the secularist debate from what I'm going to say about ethics. So I'm going to talk about the other two matters, about atheism and about humanism, and what the consequences are for our thinking there of our being atheists. And of course, just before I do, I must say, because it's an important point, that the very term atheism is, of course, a theistic term. It comes from people who have an interest in there being deities or a deity, and who think that the presence of such a thing in the universe makes a difference to how we live our lives. And so the theist is the person who describes somebody who doesn't share his or her views as an atheist. And I often say I would very, very much rather be described as an a-fairyist, because that shifts the discussion onto the ground about the existence of fairies and what they do and how they affect our lives. And if we have reasons for thinking that there aren't fairies, then these would be good and compelling reasons that we could export to other things that might not exist, like gnomes or pixies or deities. And if you shift the ground in that way, of course, you get off the terrain where there are so many assumptions and presuppositions on the part of the theist that it becomes rather difficult to have that conversation with the theist. And by the way, almost always when I say this, I'm charged with trivializing the discussion. And I have to point out that it doesn't trivialize the discussion at all, because for a very, very long time through human history, and in fact in my own country, in England particularly, there was, until the late 19th century, a very profound belief in fairies. If you couldn't find your laces, or if the milk curdled, or if the bread went mouldy or something, it was the fault of the fairies. In fact, ordinary folk in England had much more to do with fairies than they did with God. And the reason why the Church of England founded its primary schools, and this is a relishable irony, was to combat superstition about fairies. So when people say this is a trivializing point to make, it's not at all, because it's a relevant historical one. So I do like to shift that ground, but given that the terms of the debate are as they are at the moment, one can raise a kind of ethical issue, a very important kind of ethical issue about the theism-atheism discussion. And it's not the straightforward ethical thing. We think, when we talk about ethics, about how we should live, what kind of people we should be, rights and wrongs, good and bad, obligation, the sorts of principles that direct and shape our relationships with other people and the world, and how we conceive of ourselves. And that, of course, is the main meaning of ethics. And when I come to the humanism part of this, I shall be meaning that. And it's important to say in that connection that ethics, the concept of ethics, is a much broader, more inclusive concept than the concept of morality. Morality is a very important part of ethics, it's a very central part of it, and it does indeed address specifically those things about right character, right action, obligations to other people, and the rest. But the reason why the concept of ethics is broader than that is because the concept of ethics includes the idea of our achievement of ourselves as mature, adult, reflective human beings, and this is the second leg on which the point runs, the kinds of relationships, therefore, that we establish with other people. Because we all know from experience, as well as from reflection, that the idea of a good life, a life of flourishing and achievement, a life which is richly worth living, is one which is going to have at the very heart of it good relationships with other people, and especially good intimate relationships. And so the idea of what sort of person you are and how you value things and what things you wish to do with your life and how you wish to achieve something in it have to do with this rather broader thing than merely whether it's right or wrong to keep the £20 note you found on the floor, or whether you have certain obligations to tell people the truth, even if it would be socially disastrous to do so. You know, does some part of my anatomy look big in this? What kind of answer do you give to that? What's the moral answer to give to that? Is telling the truth in that kind of case always a good thing? There is a doctrine of the Church of Scotland, of all places, which says that it is a sin to tell an untimely truth. So that's obviously a moral matter. But that's particularly about cases of our acting and what the consequences of our acting are, what our intentions are in discharging obligations to others. More narrowly, therefore, the set of moral considerations. But that broader set of ethical considerations is what we mean when we talk about ethics. And that's why we can use the term not only in connection with humanism, as I will do later, but in connection with being an atheist. And I'm going to argue that there is an ethical obligation to be an atheist. Not an ethical obligation in the humanist sense, but in the sense of the ethics of rationality, the ethics of how we behave ourselves when we are thinking about the world, making inquiries about the world, studying the world, gathering the evidence on which to base our actions and our conclusions. That there is an ethics of inquiry, an ethics of rationality, which, if scrupulously observed, would surely make us atheists. And so that's my first point.